Okay, welcome everyone to this week's CWI media broadcast. My name's Theo Sharif and I'm going to be hosting today's discussion. Just before we begin, I'd like to welcome all our viewers to visit socialistworld.net to read more of the analysis of the Committee for Workers International, and just to remind our viewers that all of our streams are available live but also to watch afterwards on our YouTube channel, CWI Media. So we'd also invite you to subscribe to that channel, share it, and like the videos on the CWI Media YouTube channel. Now this week we're going to be discussing the situation in Israel-Palestine, where following 11 days of a brutal conflict and bombardment of Gaza by the Israeli army, which has left hundreds of Palestinians dead, thousands more injured and displaced from their homes, a ceasefire has now been agreed to by the Israeli government. Such was the anger, the level of anger at the bloodletting of the Israeli state and the lack of confidence in the pro-capitalist powers to ensure an end to the violence in the region. International protests in solidarity with Palestine, which started during the war, have continued, mainly of young people, for whom many fresh questions have been raised about what can be done to put an end once and for all to the national oppression of Palestine. So joining me today to discuss this, and also to discuss on top of that, what relevance do socialist ideas have in fighting for Palestinian liberation? I have three guests with me this week. I have Judy Beishon, who is from the Executive Committee of the Socialist Party of England and Wales, the England and Wales section of the CWI. I'm also joined by Bob Larby from the International Secretariat of the CWI, and finally Amnon Cohen, who is a member of the Socialist Party in England and Wales and who himself actually has lived in Israel for a number of years. So welcome to all three of our guests. Now the first question, just before we get a bit more into the detail of the discussion, the first question is for Judy. I think it'd be good just to have a little bit of brief background. What was the run-up to this war and the recent brutal attacks by the Israeli army on Gaza?
Yes, well, indeed, Theo, it was really a very brutal bombardment of Gaza by the Israeli military, which did lead to terrible loss of life and devastation, which in the CWI we utterly condemn. There was over 250 deaths in Gaza, and that includes 66 children, and around 2,000 people were wounded, many of them with life-changing injuries. There were also 12 deaths in Israel as well. Now, these wars are clearly an absolute nightmare for the Gazan population in particular, a trapped population with nowhere safe to go to away from the bombing. And this was the fourth war on the Hamas-led Gaza Strip in the 13 years that Hamas has actually been in the ruling, the ruling power, if you like, in that area, in that strip. Now, I think one fact which gives a clue to the contributory factors behind this, well, you could say behind each of these wars, in fact, all four of them, is that they've each taken place not long before a general election in Israel, when the Israeli governments have been trying to prove that they're strong against security threats. But then when you look at the actual incidences that led to this particular war, it was really based in East Jerusalem, where there was very repressive policing of Palestinian protests and gatherings. There were also provocations by the far right, the Israeli far right in East Jerusalem, really around two particular flashpoints: evictions of Palestinian families in a suburb of East Jerusalem, where the evictions were going to court, and there were quite strong Palestinian protests, youth-led protests, against these evictions, which were very heavily repressed by the police. And the far right were also going into that area, provoking these clashes and trying to provoke the residents and the protesters. But secondly, there was some very brutal and oppressive policing really throughout the month of Ramadan, and the gatherings that were taking place in East Jerusalem, in and outside the Al-Aqsa Mosque, around the Damascus Gate in East Jerusalem. There were very large protests of Palestinians against this repressive policing, but the outrage that really lit the fuse on an eruption of protest was when the Israeli police stormed the Al-Aqsa Mosque and compound, which was about the end of the first week of May and the few days after that, where the police went in with rubber bullets, with tear gas, firing them into crowds of Palestinians in that compound and even in the mosque itself, causing injuries to quite a number of Palestinians who were there. And really that was an atrocity, which was a massive attack on the freedom to worship, basically, at what is the third holiest site, religious site in Islam. And really it was in particular, I mean, it was all of these factors, but particularly in reaction to that atrocity, there was a big outbreak of Palestinian protests, not just in East Jerusalem, but across the West Bank, in Gaza, and also in the Palestinian areas of Israel as well. And then, we saw that Hamas and Islamic Jihad fired rockets from the Gaza Strip into Israel, which was in turn seized on by Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu to start that horrific war, really pounding the Gaza Strip with missiles. So those were the immediate triggers. But before I just end on this question, that the fundamental underlying reason for this war is the fact that the Palestinians will not give up on their fight for liberation. They have extremely high determination and huge staying power on this. And the Israeli regime refuses them any kind of genuine state, has done for decades, and has no solution to this conflict, this national conflict. So over decades, there's been cycles of bloodshed, which will continue without a socialist solution.
Okay, thanks for that, Judy. I think that's very helpful for understanding what the situation in Israel-Palestine is. But just to turn for a moment now, in the next question for you, Amnon, a bit more to the situation within Israel itself. As I said before, Amnon, you spent many years living in Israel. What is the situation in Israel itself actually like? Judy mentioned then the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who claims that he is acting in the interests and defending the Israeli population with all of this. How true is that? And another thing that I wanted to sort of throw in there, Amnon, is I think a feature of this, this new situation has been the movement by Arabs themselves within Israel. And how significant has that been in recent events?
Yes, well, there is obviously a sense of relief that the bombardment is over, and people have, there's a return to a certain extent of normal life. Kids are back in school. The areas, the cities in the south like Sderot and Ashkelon are repairing the damage done by the missile strikes. But really none of the problems have been resolved. And yes, Netanyahu, as you hinted, he's posed himself as the defender of the security, Mr. Security, the defender of the security of ordinary Israelis, the leader who is strong against the Hamas. But he hasn't done a good job in terms of defending defending the working class. I mean, you look at cities like Ashkelon in the south, which was the #1 target for Hamas rockets. Only a quarter of buildings there don't have air raid shelters of any kind within reach. And during a war, he can rattle his saber and pose show great concern for the safety of the residents of the south. But once the war is over, he doesn't lift a finger to solve the problems of these areas, which are unemployment, black spots, where there's nothing, for people during peacetime. So I mean, his motivation for the war. I mean, as Judy hinted, these wars always seem to happen just before an election, and there's been 4 elections in the last 2 years, all of them inconclusive. None of them led to a stable government, and Netanyahu, after the last election, has failed in his attempt to form a government. The negotiations have gone to his opponent, Yair Lapid, who's a former TV anchor, who's in opposition as he's a different person, but his coalition doesn't really have different policies. And he was trying to form a coalition with Natalie Bennett of the Yamina party. It's extreme right settler party to the right of Netanyahu's Likud, together with Mansour Abbas, who leads the United Arab List, which is an Islamic fundamentalist party. So that coalition would have been a very strange and very unstable creature. But Netanyahu, at this time, he did need to. He felt he needed to needed a war to rally the country around him as a caretaker prime minister, and also to blast apart a coalition, which a potential coalition which included an Arab party. So, and many Israelis do see this as a war to defend Netanyahu's right to carry on living in the house in Balfour, in the prime minister's official residence. Another issue which is adds urgency to Netanyahu's need for this war is the corruption trials. He's got 4 separate corruption charges. These charges, he's on trial for them, and in order to stay in jail, he needs to stay on as prime minister, and ideally, from his point of view, get a coalition which will enact a law giving himself retroactive immunity from prosecution. So it's been a very cynical war from Netanyahu's point of view. A lot of people do see that. The problem is there's no viable alternative. In the working class does not have a party in Israel, but neither does the capitalist class. In the early years of state, the Labour Party which was the main party of the capitalists, despite the name, it had almost half the seats in the Knesset. It was almost a permanent party of government. And they've now been reduced to 7 seats they now have in the elections. The capitalists have created centre parties, one after another, to try to fill the void, to try to give them a more stable base to rule. Because for the Likud and Netanyahu, from their point of view, is quite a right populist party. It's a party which puts its own narrow, immediate interest of survival before the interests of a wider capitalist class, and is too provocative, too destabilizing, and too threatening of the profits and the status quo of the capitalists. Yes, you asked about the question of the solidarity actions and the movement from the Palestinians within Israel proper, or the Palestinians of 48, or the Israeli Arabs. And this is significant because the policy of the Israeli state has always been one of divide and rule, to divide between the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza, and the Palestinians in Israel proper, as it would call them, the Israeli Arabs. Because of increased repression of Palestinians in Israel proper, because of policies which have been enacted over the past decade of really driving those Palestinians out of the mixed city, or attempting to drive them out of the mixed cities by not just gentrification, which has happened in the past in places like Jaffa, but also by taking over buildings, setting up rabbinical academies, putting settlers in the heart of those areas, and house by house driving the Arabs out of those areas in Lod, in Jaffa, in Akko. That has really linked up, which is very similar to the situation in Sheikh Jarrah. That has, and then on top of that, increased impoverishment because of the coronavirus crisis, that has really bound the interest of the Palestinians in Israel proper with those in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. So we have had big demonstrations. We've had demonstrations in Jaffa. We've had in Al-Fahim, which is a city in the center of the country, demonstrations which blocked the main road going up to the Galilee. And there has been, of course, a general strike on last Tuesday, when which shut down the entire building construction sector was shut down, with only 150 of 65,000 construction workers turning up to work on that day, and that strike was accompanied by wide demonstrations. So it's really the spread of the movement to the communities, the Arab communities in Israel proper, which is one of the things which has frightened the authorities. It has put them on the back foot, and that was the reason why on the 10th of May they did make certain concessions, like rerouting the contentious, the supremacist march, the March of the Flags in the old city of Jerusalem, delaying the court ruling on the eviction of the Palestinians from Sheikh Jarrah.
Brilliant. Cheers for that, Amnon. And we're going to come back to this topic that you touched on there at the end about sort of the workers' movement and the role of the workers' movement within Israel itself. But just jumping back briefly to what you mentioned right at the start, actually, understandably, the very big sense of relief that exists in Israel-Palestine at the announcement of the ceasefire. Now, following the ceasefire, attention has now turned to the question of negotiations and peace talks. And this next question is for you, Bob, that I saw in the news the United Arab Emirates and other countries have sort of stepped in, offering to broker a peace deal between the two sides. How likely is that? How likely is it, that these other capitalist governments can intervene, can step in and deliver, lasting peace and broker that kind of deal?
Well, unfortunately, put it very briefly, that is extremely unlikely. In fact, it is ruled out, because we've already seen historically attempts to patch up some kind of agreement, to reach some kind of settlement on the basis of capitalism. Most notably, we saw it in the Oslo Accords of nearly 30 years ago, which ended up just being words, just being something which was not even attempted to be really implemented. And I think that that's part of the background to what we've seen in the last few days, because in many ways, we're witnessing, I think, a possible turning point in the situation. Because as Judy said, to a certain extent, this confrontation was provoked deliberately, but for Netanyahu, for his own reasons, as Amnon also mentioned. But in reality, what actually happened was a big shock to Netanyahu, the spread of protest within Israel, within the 1967 borders. For the first time for over 20 years, we saw sizable movements of Arab Israeli citizens, Arabs who also are Israeli citizens, moving against the regime, protesting in solidarity with the Palestinians in Jerusalem and in the occupied territories, and in particular in Gaza. At the same time, it was a, if you like, unsurprising in a way, shattering of the plan which Trump tried to impose. Only a few weeks ago, Trump's son-in-law was saying that the plans which Trump had implemented in the Middle East, the so-called Abraham Accords, meant that the Arab-Israeli conflict was in its last vestiges, was actually dying out. But all these sort of hopes, if you like, or illusions of Trump and co, and the hopes of Netanyahu, were, if you like, broken by the scale of this opposition, by the scale of the movement. From the point of view of not just the rulers of Israel, but also the big imperialist rulers like Biden, the rulers of many other Arab and Middle Eastern countries, feared how these events could actually unfold. We already have a situation where, continuing this year, we've seen in different countries in North Africa and the Middle East, protests taking place. There is a fear of revolution. Earlier this year, the regional director of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, was warning states in the Middle East not to carry out automatically austerity, to be prepared to be a bit more flexible. For instance, instead of having austerity, we're talking about increasing spending on education and health, and perhaps even helping those people, as he put it, who are in need. Because the whole region, if you like, is bubbling. The whole region has a basic instability in it, not just caused by, if you like, the national conflict in Palestine, but also from the point of view of the impact of the world economic situation, the impact of coronavirus. All of this has, if you like, created a very unstable situation. And it's because of this that, if you like, the Biden now, initially he was silent, just supporting, as he put it, Israel's right to defend itself, not saying a word about the character of the attacks, the brutality which was being inflicted on Gaza. But now is talking about the possibility of trying to see, could there be some kind of a solution, etc., etc. As already been mentioned, Arab countries like the UAE and Egypt are talking about, could they be conciliators, could they be negotiators, etc., etc. And we have to really see that on the basis of capitalism, there is no solution to this conflict. How on the basis of capitalism is it going to be possible to remove the national oppression of the Palestinians and at the same time give all the peoples of the Middle East not just freedom from oppression, but also hope in a secure future for themselves? On the basis of the scarcity and the crisis of capitalism, it is not going to be possible, if you like, to establish any secure peace, any secure future. That's not to say that perhaps there couldn't be some elements of reforms actually implemented. It's not impossible that would actually take place. But such changes would tend to be minor. Such changes would not deal with the fundamental questions of how can the Palestinian people escape from this oppression? How can the Israeli population, if you like, have a feeling of security about their future, and at the same time, if you like, not be linked in this conflict with the Palestinians over land and over all the other issues? These are the key questions which the imperialists, while they may, if you like, try and get some reforms, will not be able to fundamentally deal with.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Bob. I think that answers the question pretty clearly. Now, returning again to the situation in Palestine, and this next question for Judy, what about the political parties and the situation within Palestine itself? Hamas and present themselves as, you know, the party, the main defenders of the Palestinian people, as the main party fighting for Palestinian liberation. What do they in reality stand for, and do we consider them? Do we think they offer a way forward for the struggle?
Well, Hamas is an acronym for Islamic Resistance Movement, and it sets its goal as liberating Palestine. But it doesn't actually have any strategy for doing that, for carrying that out. And that's been shown really ever since it's existed. And also, it's a pro-capitalist party, which means it's not going to be able to offer Palestinians decent living standards in a Palestinian state in the future, in any case. So we can also say that, by the way, on both of these accounts, on the issue of the national conflict and on the issue of achieving decent living standards, Fatah is also unable to provide a solution on either of these. Fatah's the ruling party in parts of the West Bank, where the Palestinian Authority is formally in control. We've seen this rocket fire by Hamas and other militias, in particular Islamic Jihad, coming from Gaza into Israel. And that's really a way of them trying to appear as counter-aggressors to the Israeli aggression, to appear as leading a fight back against what, of course, is very brutal shelling and so on, and policing by the Israeli military. But of course, those rockets, they're rudimentary. They're nowhere near the firepower that Israel has got. So they're not going to be able to achieve success from that method, military success from that method. And unfortunately, there's another side to this issue, which we've pointed out, we always point out in our material in the CWI, that the rockets kill Israeli civilians, and therefore they don't help win Israeli civilians to the Palestinian cause, but rather they have the effect of pushing Israeli workers closer to their right-wing ministers, their right-wing political leaders and so on, who say that brutal force has got to be used against the Palestinians. So it's instead of opening up the class divide in Israel, it's doing the opposite, in fact, those methods, the rockets and so on. And really, though, a workers' movement needs to be built in Israel that can challenge and eventually remove the Israeli capitalist class. So the strategy needs to be to try and widen that class gap in Israel. That should be part of the aim of the Palestinian struggle in order to help their struggle. So what does that mean? Well, it means that their struggle needs to be aimed in particular at the occupation and at the apparatus of repression in the territories, rather than any of their methods being aimed directly at Israeli civilians. But very, very importantly, for success against the occupation, then they need mass popular action. They need to rebuild mass popular action of the type that we saw in the first Intifada. A third Intifada only, we've used the words a socialist Intifada in our material because it needs to be fully democratically organised under the control and decisions of ordinary Palestinians, under grassroots control, and fully accountable decisions for all the actions. Whoever's making, the elected people making those decisions are accountable to those that have elected them. And it's that kind of mass, building that kind of mass revolt that the Israeli army would not be able to defeat militarily, because you only have to look at what happened in the Arab Spring with the way that huge mass movements in Egypt and in Tunisia managed to remove brutal dictators who had really strong military apparatuses, to see that a mass movement, that those kind of apparatuses cannot be used to defeat a mass movement of that kind of scale. So that's really what needs to be the aim of the Palestinian struggle, to grow the movement to the extent and build actions, mass actions, that can make the occupation completely untenable for the Israeli ruling class. And that would then set the scene for a genuine self-determination for the Palestinian people. And I mean, Amnon referred to some of the successes that happened just before this war broke out amongst the Palestinians in East Jerusalem. The fact that a court hearing was postponed that was going to ratify the evictions of Palestinians from their homes. The protests led to the barriers being moved at Damascus Gate during Ramadan that was stopping Palestinians from congregating, and a right-wing nationalist march being cancelled as well that was going to go through the Arab part of the old city of Jerusalem, very provocative. And those are the kind of struggles that can be built on further, that can be linked up, that could be built into a mass movement across the territories, and of course with the support of Palestinians inside Israel now as well, which has been, has been referred to already, a very important feature of this latest round of eruption, really, of protests. And really a movement of that scale, a really powerful movement, could then do two things. One is defend the Palestinians from brutal assaults by the Israeli military, but also, have offensive actions against the occupation as well. And I've already referred to the need for it to be democratic, for elected committees to be put into place. And we would also say that the Palestinians need to build their own, not just their own organisations of struggle and action, but also their own political party, independent of capitalist interests. Because capitalism is, and Bob's referred to this, we'll all keep referring to this, capitalism is rotten to the core. It's not going to be able to get rid of poverty in the Palestinian territories. It's not going to be able to provide the basic necessities of life. So a Palestinian political party armed with a socialist program is going to need to be built. And this just, my final points on this question. And this comes back to why we are fundamentally completely opposed to organisations like Hamas and like Fatah and many of the other pro-capitalist Palestinian parties, because they are pro-capitalist, they are opposed to socialism. They won't be able to deliver a decent life to the Palestinian people, and they're certainly not democratic in the way that they rule. And in fact, they feel threatened by mass movements. They do not want to see mass movements that would, in fact, remove their positions, remove their privileges and their positions of leaders of the leaders of the Palestinian struggle. And you've just seen how Fatah Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, has cancelled the elections that were planned for May and July, and they were going to be the first elections for 15 years in the Palestinian territories. So there's enormous anger about that, and it just shows, how undemocratic, in fact, they are. That's just one example. And Hamas opposed the cancellation of the elections, but Hamas only has minority support in the territories. It's even in the Gaza Strip, which is its strongest base. It generally, in the polls, gets 30-odd% of support in those polls. So you can see that Hamas is not seen as a way forward by the Palestinians either. So it comes back to the point that a workers' party is needed. A workers' party needs to be built based on workers' interests, and that's extremely urgent.
Absolutely, Judy. Thanks for that. And again, going back to, Judy finished on that point, the necessity of building workers' organisations and parties, and that was something that Amnon touched on at the end of his last answer with relation to Israel itself. So Amnon, what is the state of the workers' movement within Israel and the trade unions, and is it possible to win a base of support amongst Israeli workers for socialist ideas?
About 500,000, just over 500,000 Israeli workers are unionized, mainly in the Histadrut, which is a very right-wing, bureaucratized union, whose leadership is very hesitant to organize any kind of action to defend workers' interests. But workers are, despite that, compelled to struggle. So on the 10th of of May, the same day that there were mass protests going on in East Jerusalem, there were protests going on in Tel Aviv, where protests by Israeli doctors who were on strike, and they were blocking the main motorway going through the center of Tel Aviv. And the issue was the government had decided coronavirus had been dealt with, and they didn't need they could reduce the numbers of doctors on the rosters as a result. So it was a strike against planned redundancies of affecting hundreds of doctors. There's been quite a number of strikes over the last year. Just in the last year, there was a 18-day strike of social workers. They won, and it was a strike for social workers. It's one for workplaces which are mixed. We have both Israeli and Palestinian workers, and they won. And they won a certain improvement in conditions, a partial victory. There was also a one-day strike of nurses, which again is a mixed workforce, both Jewish and Arab nurses, and they won higher manning levels after one day's strike action. I mean, one for worrying, in most worrying developments we've seen in the last 2 weeks has been the descent into elements of intercommunal civil war, which we've seen in some of the mixed cities. And there has been statements and actions by some of the workers' groups to oppose that. And there was a statement by a small but important union, Koach L'Ovdim, which means Power to the Workers, which is led by Ami Vettori. And he and the rest of the leadership said, we are a union which comprises Jewish and Arab workers. During normal times, we defend their livelihoods, their working conditions, and during wartime, we also have to defend their physical safety. And there was one incident where a bus garage was attacked by extreme right Jewish thugs who tried to lynch Arab bus drivers, and the Jewish bus drivers organized to block off the bus garage, to drive away the bigots, and then to organize a convoy so that all the Arab bus drivers could get to their homes safely. I mean, generally, there is enormous racism in Israeli society, and the most recent war has ratcheted up the degree of racism that exists. And there is also the mood, amongst large areas of Israeli workers. The Hamas missiles have been fairly ineffective. They've created very little physical damage, but politically, they give a message. It strengthens Netanyahu's message that Arabs want to kill you. You have no alternative but to fight them. So it has increased the racism. But on the other hand, where workers are compelled to take industrial action in workplaces which are mixed, it is clear to the workers, whatever their preconceptions are, it's clear to them that they need to have a united strike, that Jewish and Palestinian workers need to strike together, because otherwise the bosses will divide them and defeat them. So that is, it's a complicated, it's a contradictory situation, but there is, where there is class struggle, there are possibilities. And we've seen also in the past how quickly things can change. So in 2011, Judy mentioned the Arab Spring, and we had, after the overthrow of Mubarak, there was a massive movement in Israel, which started off by two women who were evicted from their rented apartment, and they found they couldn't afford to rent anywhere else, and they set up tents in Rothschild, which is the main boulevard in Tel Aviv, and they put on Facebook a message: if you can't afford the rent, bring your tent and set up a tent next to ours. And within weeks, there were thousands and thousands of tents, not only in Rothschild, but in all the main boulevards, not only in Tel Aviv, but in all the main cities of Israel. and that was accompanied by demonstrations which reached hundreds of thousands of demonstrators, which is in Israel, which was a small country, was an enormous proportion of the population was physically demonstrating. And the movement initially was a movement against the high price of accommodation, but as it became more of a mass movement and it became more generalized its demands, and it moved to raise demands against government corruption, against rule of oligarchs. The big slogan was a fairly confused slogan: "The people demand social justice." And unfortunately, that movement was defeated because of inexperience of leadership. The first people who set up the tents became the leaders of the movement. They weren't experienced. There was no democratic control of the movement. And when Netanyahu told them, "Okay, I'll set up a committee to deal with your grievances," they agreed to disband the movement. But it did show the government. It was really an echo of Tahrir Square. It was an echo of the Arab Spring, and it did. There was a feeling of what could be achieved. When people are mobilized, when people, when working people are prepared to struggle, but also that the need for a workers' party to deal with that, to actually lead it to victory. I mean, just during the last year, there's been constant demonstrations. Every week, there's been demonstrations outside the Prime Minister's residence in Jerusalem, and there's the big demand has been lech, which is go. It's been a confused movement, which includes also capitalists. The main wing of the capitalists want to get rid of Netanyahu, but without the problem with the movement is that Netanyahu is not the source of a crisis of Israeli capitalism. He is a symptom of a crisis of Israeli capitalism. Israeli capitalism cannot provide, Bob explained, cannot provide peace, cannot provide a Palestinian state, but also cannot provide a decent future to ordinary Israeli workers. There's been a massive decrease in living standards over the pandemic. The average family income has decreased by 22.7% over the last year. There's 2 million are unemployed. 150,000 became unemployed just during the last lockdown. There's people who had high-paid jobs in the high-tech sector who've been furloughed and who can no longer afford to feed their kids and are now dependent on food banks. And all Israeli capitalism can offer ordinary Israelis is high prices, low wages, and permanent insecurity and permanent warfare. And it's only a socialist, only a workers' party armed with a socialist program which can offer ordinary Israelis as well as ordinary Palestinians a decent future.
Great, thank you, Amnon. And I guess just for Bob, just to sum up the discussion that we've had today, I think we've heard rightly numerous times in this broadcast that this crisis is unlikely. It's not possible to be resolved on the basis of capitalism. This has been the fourth war on Gaza since 2008, wars which always end in various futile cycles of peace talks. So what is the way forward, does the CWI say? What do we demand and propose as a socialist solution for national liberation for the Palestinians and to end war in the region?
Well, as it's just been said, one of the themes of this broadcast, and in fact the program of the CWI, is that there really is, unfortunately, no solution. I say unfortunately because it means a real struggle to change your society, to change the situation. But there's no solution on the basis of the present society and the way which the society is run, which means on the basis of capitalism. And this isn't a slogan. It isn't abstract. If you just look at every country in the Middle East, none of them have got full democratic rights. Some are out and out dictatorships, like in Saudi Arabia. Some are totalitarian regimes, like in Egypt, and even in Israel, which is sometimes presented as the one quote unquote democracy in the Middle East. It's a very peculiar democracy, because a big chunk of the population don't have full democratic rights. Even because of new laws, they're not regarded as full citizens. Their language is no longer regarded as an equal language to that of the majority of citizens of Israel. So there's not a single, even traditional capitalist democracy, or something you could say a normal, quote unquote, capitalist democracy anywhere in the Middle East. And it's not simply a political question. It reflects national questions like in Israel, and also the deep social and economic crisis in the region. The Middle East isn't unique to this, but we see the huge amount of unemployment, particularly affecting young people. And many of the countries in the Middle East have got a young population. So in this situation, it's not abstract to say that the present system cannot provide the basis of life, cannot guarantee democratic rights. In fact, it's based on chaos and oppression. And at the same time, then, the issue is what can actually be done about it. And as Judy said a bit earlier, the question is of how do you build a movement? Protests can be very important. Protests can have a big effect. But to change society, you need to become organized. The masses need to become organized in order that they can challenge the ruling classes, challenge the ruling elites, but not just challenge them, but take power away from them. And that is why the question of getting organized is so important. Obviously, it can be very difficult. In many of the countries in the Middle East, there is different degrees of repression. And also, we see that in Israel itself, particularly in the occupied territories at the present time. But nevertheless, even in the face of repression, it is possible to organize get organized and begin to develop a movement, even if it isn't a fully legal movement at the present time. It develops, first of all, as a sort of semi-legal movement. We see this at the moment in Iran, where we have in the last few years seen a real development of the beginnings of a new workers' movement in Iran, which is against the regime. It's not fully legal. It suffers repression. At the same time, the regime can't fully crush it, because it has already got bases of support among sections of the population. So it is possible to begin the organization of such opposition. And in that organization, the role of activists is absolutely key. Amnon mentioned the appeal of the power to the workers' trade union in Israel against the racism, against the sectarian divides, the clashes rather, which have developed in the past few weeks. And it's a question of how do you build upon such appeals? How do you build upon also the experience, as Amnon also said, of the experience of workers, that when they work together, they see they can have a common interest, a collective interest against the employers, against the attacks which they actually face. And it's a question of developing a program and a strategy in order to build such a movement. And that is why, as we've been trying to explain in this broadcast, it's important to have a program which is absolutely clear against repression, stands against any form of repression, and at the same time tries to offer working people of all nationalities, of all different religions, as a way forward to a secure life, not just a life which is free from oppression, but also a life which is free from all the torment, if you like, of living under capitalism, the insecurity under capitalism. And that means, if you like, striving to build such a movement, and also with the vision of trying to develop common struggles between the different nationalities, between workers of the different nationalities and of different religions. That really is the key to the way forward. It's not going to be easy, not going to be easy at all. But at the same time, there is no other alternative. That's the situation. You can even put it to the, if you like, to Israelis, to Jewish Israelis. What is the future? One war every few years? The whole history of Israel from the formation in 1948 has been one war after another. As Amnon said, the leaders trade on that fear of being defeated. But is that the sort of society they want to live in, where there's always the fear of the next war and on a nationalist basis, the fear of being defeated in the next war, and what would that possibly mean? That's no way to live. That's no security. It's one reason why so many young Israelis try to get out of the country and to move away, because they don't want to live in that sort of society where they're always worried, when will the next war be? What will be the result of it? What will it actually mean? That's no way to actually live. And we've got to present a program, a policy which could begin to overcome that. We sketched that out from the point of view of fighting against oppression, but recognizing the rights of all the nationalities in the area. And then through building a common struggle against oppression, then for the nationalities themselves to work out what exactly should be the shape of a future society. What exactly should be the shape of a future society, not just on the basis of struggling against capitalism, but also to ensure there is no national oppression, which is why we argue that one of the possibilities which can be discussed by the activists themselves is the idea of having two states, not on the basis of the two-state solution, which is often put forward by capitalists, because the two-state solution on the basis of capitalism is no solution. What we mean by that is on the basis of overthrowing capitalism, the Palestinians and the Israelis have the possibility, if they wanted to set up their own states on the basis of overthrowing capitalism and forming some kind of unity, some kind of confederation, some kind of link. We don't want to spell it out in detail. It's up to the working people in the Middle East to work out the details themselves. But the idea of a society, of building societies where there is no oppression, either on the basis of nationality, religion, or from capitalism itself, that is the key. And from the point of view of internationally, the tasks which face the workers' movement is obviously opposing the repression which takes place, opposing the way in which the imperialist countries in the West support Israel. Despite Israel's wealth, if you like, is really a modern society, it is still the second highest recipient of aid from the US, and most of that aid is military help. We have to be against these sort of things. We have to be against the propping up of repressive regimes, whether it be Israel when it suppresses the Palestinians, or regimes like the Saudi regime and the other dictatorships in the Middle East, against those being propped up, at the same time giving concrete support to those involved in struggles against these regimes, not just those involved in struggles, but also those aiming to build the type of movement which is necessary if we're going to get out of this nightmare of continuous repression and repeated wars. That really is the challenge which we face in the future. And because of the experience of repeated wars, there will be people who will be thinking, what is the way out? We can't go on the way it is. And it's on that basis of getting involved in a dialogue, discussing, and also concretely organizing to participate in movements that will be possible to build the sort of conscious movement which is necessary if we're going to end this nightmare once and for all.
Brilliant. Thanks, Barb. And with that, we conclude today's discussion and broadcast. So thank you, Barb, and also thank you, Judy and Amnon, for joining us, and of course for everyone watching the broadcast today as well. Now, just before we finish, a few announcements. Again, like I said earlier, if you want to read more analysis of the CWI, please visit socialistworld.net. Also, some of our social media stuff as well. Follow us on Twitter at CWI Socialist, our Facebook page, Socialist World CWI, and Instagram as well, which is at Socialist World. And all of our streams are available live and to watch after on our YouTube channel, CWI Media. They're also free to watch on our Facebook as well. So thanks everyone for joining us. Just a final announcement about future broadcasts. We're planning on moving back to Sunday afternoon broadcasts. So the plan at the moment is for our next broadcast to go out at 3 p.m. British Summer Time on Sunday, the 6th of June. But please, keep an eye on our Facebook, our Instagram for further announcements about our future broadcast, for updates on that. But until next time, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you soon.